Today we're going to take a new look at this old family portrait. You know, it's the one that many of us grew up with. And so you might say this is the story of a brave new prehistoric world, a story of cutting-edge science and heated debate about the evolution of our species, Homo sapiens. To get us started, here's a quick timeline. It was around 6 to 8 million years ago that humans and chimpanzees branched off from a common ancestor. And from then, it took about another 4 million years for an adventurous group of archaic humans called Homo erectus, or upright man, to leave Africa. Now, this group spread across a wide swath from southern Europe to eastern Asia, and were last seen, at least according to the fossil record, about 108,000 years ago in Indonesia. That timing probably overlapped with that of early Homo sapiens, but fossil evidence seems to put them in different geographic locations, so whether members of the two groups ever met, that is still an open question. Now, all of this was going on in what archaeologists call the Middle to Late Paleolithic, a period that has yielded stunning discoveries. In just the last decade, we've learned that between roughly 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, at least 6 other groups of early hominids walked the Earth at the same time as Homo sapiens. The previously much maligned Neanderthals, a group in Asia called the Denisovans, at least 3 different groups of hobbit-like humans in South Africa, Homo naledi, in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, and in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis. And recently, we met a member of yet one more group in China called Homo longi, fondly referred to as dragon men, and it turns out that's a compliment. In North America, we also learned that a haunting set of footprints in White Sands National Park likely belonged to a group of early humans who lived there before the last glacial maximum or ice age, which is tens of thousands of years before conventional wisdom placed human arrival in the Americas. Is it time to completely reevaluate who we are as a species? What have we inherited from those long-lost ancestors, and what can they tell us about ourselves? We are joined today by 4 researchers whose approach to these issues come from a variety of different perspectives and who bring the tools of different disciplines to bear upon them. Joining us from Vienna, Thomas Higham, professor of evolutionary anthropology at the University of Vienna. From Doha, Sheela Athreya, a paleoanthropologist at Texas A&M's campus in Qatar. Joining us from Jerusalem, we have Viviane Slon, the head of the Ancient DNA Lab at Tel Aviv University. And from Cape Town, South Africa, Rebecca Ackermann, who is the founding director of the Human Evolution Research Institute at the University of Cape Town. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. There is incredible amount of excitement in your field, rapid changes over the last 10 years. So I'd like to start by asking each of you, what do you consider the most exciting work that's happening right now in the study of human origins? Let's begin with Viviane.
Just the ability to recover DNA from archaic hominins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, I think is very exciting. It's something relatively new, only a couple of decades that we've been able to do this. And we can now do this to the extent where we get data from the entire genome of individuals that lived tens and even hundreds of thousands of years ago. So I think there's a lot to be discovered, and it's an exciting field to be in.
Tom, how about you? What would you, if you were going to write the headline for the Globe, Mail, or whatever your favorite newspaper is, what would you say?
Well, I think Viviane has hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned. To me, the most exciting things over the last decade or two has been the revolutionary information that we can now glean from ancient genomics. This gives us the opportunity to look at the on-the-ground situation in terms of the distribution of these various actors that we have in the field of human evolution.
Becky, how about you? What's your take on that question?
So my take is that I think the most exciting thing is that it is showing us, everything that's happening in the field is showing us how complex the origin of humans is, that it's not a simple narrative, that we're not talking about, as you introduced, one group coming out and conquering everybody else. And in fact, it's a much more sophisticated thing that's going on in this space. And related to that, I think that's allowing for the emergence of, frankly, people paying attention to regions of the world that they hadn't paid attention to before. And I think long-term, that's going to be a really important part of our increasing understanding of these sort of complex origins.
Sheela, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say it's a bit of what everyone else has said so far, which is that it's a combination of the research that's coming out of areas that have historically been underrepresented or actively marginalized. And specifically, I'm thinking about East and Southeast Asia. But also, the tools are getting better to get information from the materials that are in environments that don't preserve very well. And so the work that Viviane and Tom do allows us to get information from remains that historically we wouldn't have been able to get any information from.
I have heard, maybe this is apocryphal, but there was a time when folks tried to date bones, fossils, by licking them. The tongue would stick to the old ones and not to the new ones. I presume we've gone beyond that substantially by today. Maybe we can start with radiocarbon data. I think many people are familiar with that, but just give us the basics of that, and then we can talk about how you've been pressing that field forward.
Okay, sure. So, radiocarbon is one of the most important techniques that we have for dating the archaeological past. There are some problems with it, which we'll touch on, but one of the main problems is that it runs out at about 50,000 years ago. And that's sad, because it's just about that time that the late period of human evolution becomes super exciting. We have to rely on a new range of other dating techniques that include other types of isotopes that we can use to measure, and other types of techniques that allow us to add to the dating of archaeological sites. Because, of course, dating is critical in archaeology. Looking at the presence and absence of humans and their relationships with other types of humans, it's all predicated upon having a robust chronology. And we need to know when things happened in the past in order to understand why they happened. And so radiocarbon and other techniques are crucial in this endeavor.
Yeah, sure. We've all seen, whole bones and skulls from archaeological sites, but I've seen images of some of the samples that you analyze, and many look really tiny, like this little chip off an old pinky bone. And I gather that making things yet more challenging, sometimes these samples are actually contaminated with DNA from other periods. Is that right?
It's a big problem, and it's been probably the biggest hurdle in terms of the reliable application of this method. So if you take, for example, a bone that's 50,000 years old, and you imagine contaminating it with modern carbon that's in the soil, for instance, that will produce a radiocarbon measurement that's 13,000 years too young. And so as we go back in time, so the bones and other samples get more prone to this contamination signal and contamination effect. We have to use quite sophisticated chemical methods to clean up the samples that we want to reliably date. We have many, many dates that have been produced over the last 60 years that are, unfortunately, we now know, underestimates of the real age.
So Tom, for many years now, you've been studying, among other things, Neanderthal sites across Europe and parts of Asia. And as I've read some of the research that you and your colleagues have done in these places, it paints a very different picture of Neanderthals than we had up until, just a few years ago.
We know now, to take just Neanderthals as one example, that Neanderthals, far from being this really backward, slow, dim-witted group, were actually doing extremely capable things and making objects and artifacts and innovative tools, and they were extremely well adapted. And that we had a very long period of overlap with Neanderthals and groups of Neanderthals in Eurasia and places like Europe. And the genetic legacy that we have tells us increasingly that who we are today is really part of the legacy of these interactions that we experienced in the past.
And in fact, Tom, as I understand it, the latest dating indicates that Neanderthals are engaging in these complex activities often tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even arrived on the scene in Europe. So before we go any further, I'd like to share with our viewers some of the more extraordinary sites that you and your colleagues have been studying. One of the most evocative Neanderthal sites has been found deep inside a cave in Brunekel in southwest France. Somebody, and more likely a whole group of somebodies working together, arranged hundreds of charred stalagmites into two large circles. This could have been the site of ritual shamanic or funeral ceremonies around 175,000 years ago. Since at that time Neanderthals were the only hominids in Europe, it is all but certain they were the ones who designed and built these remarkably complex structures. In yet another cave in Spain, a set of Neanderthal teeth tells the story of a young male suffering from an abscess and a stomach bug. His tartar suggests the unfortunate fellow was self-medicating with, among other things, chamomile, fungus containing penicillin, and poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, the anti-inflammatory in aspirin. Neanderthals also had style. These pieces of refined-looking bone jewelry belonged to a chic Neanderthal in France around 42,000 years ago. More than 64,000 years ago, sensitive Neanderthal souls in Spain were making cave art. The stencil of a child's hand and these abstract patterns were made 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived. That was a long time before another Spanish artist from the same region, Pablo Picasso, made a name for himself. Not bad, considering that when the first Neanderthal fossils were found, it was suggested the species be named Homo stupidus. And if all you Homo sapiens out there are starting to feel competitive, you can relax. These Paleolithic prodigies are all in the family. When Homo sapiens showed up in Europe and Asia, Neanderthals coexisted with them for several thousand years before dying out. Enough time for some of them to meet up and on occasion become intimate. We know this because Nobel Prize winner Svante Pääbo and his team have pioneered a new field called paleogenetics. Among their accomplishments, they were able to sequence the Neanderthal genome. When they did, we learned, among other things, that today modern humans of European or Asian descent on average are genetically 1 to 2% Neanderthal. Now, Viviane, that, I gather, is your field, the relatively young discipline of paleogenetics, sequencing the genome of ancient humans, which I have to say seems like an extraordinary thing to be able to do, and in some cases from just a few slivers of bone. I mean, how much can we learn from such genetic data?
The most basic way that we can sort of look at DNA of ancient hominins and other organisms, doesn't have to be hominins, is that we would take a bone or a tooth and we would drill a little hole in it to recover some powder. And then we can extract the DNA, that is, release it into a solution by using chemicals that affect both the organic and the inorganic parts of the bone. And that tells us what was essentially the genetic makeup of these ancient humans. We can tell the genetic sex, of course, but we can also see which population that these individuals were derived from, both on the maternal line that we know from a small part of our genome called the mitochondrial DNA, but also genome-wide from both parents. We can tell about issues of adaptation, for example, genetic adaptation to different environments. We can talk about kinship and social structure in ancient groups. And we'll, I'm sure, talk later on about sort of mating and movement between populations and when they met and intermixed.
So how long can genetic material last in an ancient sample?
It's very dependent on the environment. So if you're looking in permafrost, The oldest DNA sequence that has been retrieved so far, it's actually a study that came out just a few months ago, comes from mammoth remains that are of over 1 million years ago. But that's in permafrost, where essentially the samples are in a freezer for the last million years. Going outside of permafrost in more temperate climates, the oldest DNA we have so far is both bear DNA and human DNA coming from a cave in Spain called Cima de los Huesos. And these remains are dated to about 430,000 years ago. And this is sort of the extreme of what we can so far, or what has been done so far outside of permafrost. I now work in the area of the Levant, where outside temperatures are quite warm, and it's a problem for DNA preservation. We are very happy when we can find a spot that is more than 10,000 years old.
You've gone beyond extracting organic material from bones and are also studying it in just the dirt, right? In the sediment at some archaeological site. How is that going? And is this an idea that when first put forward people thought was crazy? Or is it one that people are like, yeah, that might work?
When I got interested into looking into this to try and look for ancient hominin DNA, it was considered one of the crazy projects because we thought, all of us, that it would be too hard to tell apart contamination from ancient DNA, particularly when we're working with human DNA, which is, of course, as ancient and modern, has a lot of similarities. And so this idea of being able to take, I would say, a soup of DNA that you extract from the sediment, so this sediment sample can contain DNA from plants and from microbes and from different animals, and to be able to say something about that population, it's Neanderthal, it's Denisovan, it's something else. No, it was definitely supposed to be a crazy project, but we did a pilot study and we found that it does work when you can go to an archaeological site and sample tens or even hundreds of samples and look for changes in the human population through sometimes tens and even hundreds of thousands of years of prehistory just by looking at sediments. So that's, I think, to me, very exciting. Yeah,
it sounds hugely exciting. We'll talk about some of the implications in just a moment, but let me turn to Becky now. There's this, I don't know, almost canonical story that many of us have been told, at least those of us on the outside of the field, that, you know, there is an evolutionary record in which species evolve, they diverge, they branch off. And one of those branches over the course of evolutionary history ultimately resulted in us. Right? I think that's sort of a familiar story that many people have heard. I gather there's growing evidence, and your perspective is that metaphor, that framework really needs to be retired in some sense, or at least updated in a significant way to include the kinds of mixings that we're going to talk about more that we've already heard reference to. Just give us a sense of where you come down on the right way of thinking about things.
I come down firmly in the braided stream kind of space. So instead of there being just a branching and one thing leads through, you have quite a lot more interaction, and you have merger as through hybridization that results in gene flow. That itself doesn't just bring things together, it can also be the producer of novelty and new variation.
So gene flow, if you can just give us a sense of what that term means, because I know it's going to be vital to what we're talking about.
Yeah, so we kind of use these terms a bit loosely sometimes. And in fact, the term that you'll see or you'll hear more often is hybridization. Essentially, hybridization is the act, right? You have organisms coming together and mating, so they're hybridizing.
When it comes to actually looking at a skeletal remain, are there telltale signs of some kind of hybridization event in the past?
Yes, there are. And that's some of the stuff I've been doing, which is looking at saying, okay, let me look at other hybrids. Let me look at other organisms, other mammals, primates, wildebeest, all sorts of things. And can we see what that signature of hybridization looks like in the skeleton so that we can use those analogs to then look at the fossil record and see if we see those same kinds of signatures. We can look again at the human fossil record and see some evidence for it.
Are there any examples you can give? Give us a sense of what sort of specific things are the signatures?
Sure, I can give an example. So I've done a lot of work in baboons. And when you look at baboon hybrids, what they show is that when you have two very different, or slightly different depending on what groups of baboons you're looking at, genomes that are coming together, but they're different enough that they cause developmental, I want to say almost glitches, if you will, the little lines in your face where your bones come together, for example, or a suture, or on your skull. Extra teeth, rotated teeth. So little small signatures that allow us to look into the fossil record and identify, and this is important, individuals who might be a hybrid.
And so when you use the word glitch, what comes to mind for me is this kind of folk myth that by bringing together different animals, different species, somehow you create, I don't know, Frankenstein-like monster structures. Has that view, which obviously comes from a very coarse reading of how the world actually works, but has that view impacted the degree to which the possibility of these hybridizations has been accepted by the community?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the community of the human evolution community more broadly, paleoanthropology in particular, has been relatively slow to uptake this for a number of reasons, but the primary one is probably because the work on hybridization, the good work on hybridization, was actually being done primarily in plant biology. And it was kind of easy for people to wrap their heads around the idea of plants hybridizing. I mean, we hybridize plants all the time. And then it moved to animal biology, but that was only, sort of 30 years ago-ish, where we started to get a real flourishing of our understanding of hybridization in animal biology. And so that field was on top of it, if you will. But that literature never really got into paleoanthropology and human evolution. So it wasn't really accessible in that way. And on top of that, as you said, people tend to have this kind of idea that hybridization is bad. That if you have hybrids, it's going to produce an offspring that's going to be mutant, or if not mutant, at least infertile, right? And that essentially wouldn't go anywhere. And what all these studies coming out of plant and animal biology have shown is that, yeah, that can happen. Sometimes you have infertile individuals, sometimes you have reduced fertility, sometimes you have lineages that come together and merge, essentially. So it basically collapses everything. But sometimes you can have the evolution of new species through hybridization that are different enough from their parents that they maybe are adaptively different, can succeed in different environments than their parents could. Sometimes you get the evolution of novelty in these new groups through new combinations of traits. And this kind of novelty and speciation is the productive force of gene flow and of hybridization that hadn't been given attention before.
Yeah, we'll look at some examples in just a moment. But Sheela, let me turn to you now. Your focus has also been in morphology, but as I understand it, you've also taken a more, what might be called a holistic approach. I mean, we heard from Tom about radiocarbon dating, other methods, Viviane in terms of a genetic approach, Becky in terms of maybe changing the paradigm where we don't view it as just a tree-like structure, but rather, I think you described it as these blending streams. I sort of like that metaphor a lot. So what's your view? Is there a new approach that really needs to take root in the field for the kind of progress that we all want to have happen to take place?
Yes, my frustration has always been the existing models that I have to put my work in. So I'm very interested in Middle and Late Pleistocene evolution in Asia. But the interpretive frameworks available to me have been language that just doesn't make sense to me. So, the origin of modern humans and extinction and the idea that Homo erectus went extinct and was replaced. I felt like I was doing like retroactive racism by saying, okay, these are pure and these are us and these are other. Asia wasn't just this recipient of evolutionary innovations that came out of Africa or even these evolutionary novelties that came from Europe, right? It wasn't unidirectional. That there was that the gene flow was moving both ways, and that maybe some of the specimens that we're looking at in Central Asia, Southwest Asia, Eastern Europe, have also been shaped by gene flow from the East.
I understand that there's yet another cranium that was found that's called Homo longi, or dragon man. This one was discovered in northeast China. And I've read that some of those who led the study, I think it was Chris Stringer of the British Museum, have suggested that maybe Homo longi is the closest relative to us in terms of the Paleolithic family tree. So does that strengthen your view that we really need to think locally about our lineage? Is that another piece of evidence in favor of that perspective?
That's a really good question, and I would actually, my answer might be unexpected to you, which is no, it doesn't strengthen it, because this comes back to some of the work I do, which really interrogates the language that we're using, right? I don't subscribe immediately to something being a new species just because it's been named as such. One of the things that I think drives this idea that this is like us, it really conforms to our understanding of what modern humans look like based on what Europeans look like, right? And so it doesn't have a big brain, doesn't have a globular head, doesn't have smaller teeth. And so rather than actually look at the fossil record in the early late Pleistocene or the late middle Pleistocene and say, well, what were the patterns of variation around the world at that time, and let that be what defines us, we take this type and then we search for it around the world. There's a very fascinating correlation between major climatic events that happen that really shape China and the Chinese landscape at the time period that all of these fossils, such as the Longi specimen and some of the other things that were recently published from the site of Xuchang and Hualongdong, that are at least sort of what Becky, works on, evidence that there were things that would have relaxed the climatic barriers and allowed for gene flow. And could that be why we're seeing some of these new morphologies at this time period around 300,000 years? It's a period of incredible warming and stability, which really facilitates populations coming together.
And does any of this have an impact on when we should imagine Homo sapiens having arrived in Asia? Do those dates need to be revamped?
I think that what needs to be revamped is the idea that Homo sapiens evolution is going to be this clean event and not a process. Homo sapiens evolution is a process. And so we can't name it as being a moment in time and an arrival in another place.
And so building on that thought, Sheela, I'd like to turn now to another set of discoveries that have challenged our previous view of early human history in Asia. We've already talked about some surprising insights involving Neanderthals in Europe before Homo sapiens arrived. On the other side of the continent, discoveries in the Altai Mountains of Siberia give us a new picture of what was happening there in roughly the same time period. Tom and Viviane, you have been deeply involved in this, but before we dive in, let's share some of the story with our audience.
This remote region on the border between Russia and China is the site of the cave of Denisova. In 2010, the team who had sequenced the Neanderthal gene made a stunning announcement that radically changed the picture of early human history. They had discovered an entirely new, unknown group of ancient humans. Remarkably, the initial evidence came from a mere sliver of pinky bone. Its nuclear DNA revealed it belonged to a young girl who lived between 52 and 76,000 years ago. The previously unknown archaic humans were named Denisovans after the cave where the pinky had been found. The Denisovans, like Neanderthals, turn out to be some of our long-lost relatives. Their DNA shows up today primarily in populations across Asia and Oceania. But Denisovan genes have been found in people as far away as the Americas. When Tom Higham and a team of Russian and Australian researchers sifted through fragments of prehistoric trash in the Denisovan cave, they concluded Denisovans lived there as early as 200,000 years ago and maybe earlier. These previously unknown relatives of ours were making jewelry and tools and living in this remote corner of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived on the continent. But Denisovans are not the only archaic humans who lived in that cave. Other bone fragments found there revealed they may have shared it for a time with Neanderthals starting around 170,000 years ago. At first, it was unclear whether or how the two groups interacted. Then in 2019, Tom Higham and Viviane Slon were involved in another astonishing discovery. Carefully searching a bag of prehistoric rubble from the cave, a member of Tom's team came upon yet another finger bone fragment less than 2.5 centimeters long. Viviane Slon's DNA analysis of this fossil made headlines. She found it was that of a 13-year-old girl whose father was Denisovan, but whose mother was Neanderthal. They named her Denny, the fruit of a liaison in that Paleolithic penthouse some 90,000 years ago. Denny is the first fossil of a first-generation human hybrid ever discovered.
So this all kind of has the makings of, I don't know, you might think of it as a prehistoric thriller, right? A kind of enticing detective story, if you will. You've got these remote caves in Siberia, in Tibet. You got layers of human habitation where groups we have identified as different species, and we can come back to that. They're living together. Apparently they're, let's say it, sleeping together. You've got a trail of genetic hybridization that reaches across the Pacific, right? Viviane and Tom, let's begin though with the discovery itself. Tom, can you talk about your work?
So the work that I and my team have been involved in really stems from a conversation and a meeting that took place at Denisova Cave itself between several colleagues. As it happens, my wife and my co-researcher, Katarina Duka, and I. And we were thinking over the course of several days whilst we were at the site of this tremendous problem at Denisova. Now, Denisova Cave has been excavated since the early 1980s, and there are thousands and thousands of bones that have been dug out of that site. And of course, they provided, in some cases, these tiny human remains, these very, very small pieces of bone that have the great benefit of having lots and lots of DNA in most of them. You could fit the bones of the Denisovans from that cave on your hand, and most of the bones, more than 95% of all of the bones excavated at the site, are tiny fragments that we simply don't know the identification of. We don't know which species they are. They could be mammoth bones, hyena bones, cattle bones. We have no idea. But amongst them lurk some undoubted human remains, human bones, of the kind that have already been identified by some of the archaeologists there. So we were thinking, well, how could we take advantage of this tremendous source of information, this tremendous preserved DNA legacy? How can we find these human remains? And so we fixed upon this recently discovered technique of ZooMS. So ZooMS or ZooMS, it's an acronym that is used to describe a really exciting new technique which takes advantage of the fact that in different animals and different species of animals, there are very slight differences in the proteins and the peptides that make up the collagen part of the bone. Collagen and proteins generally have a fantastic advantage over DNA in some respects in that they survive for much, much longer. So many more millions of years than the DNA that Viviane was talking about before. And we thought, well, what we could do would be to take a whole bunch of these bones, take them back to the lab, and just analyze every single one of them and see whether or not any of them have the fingerprint, the protein fingerprint of a hominidae, of the broader human family. And Samantha Brown, who was the student that took on the project in our lab in Oxford, she worked very hard to take small samples from each of the bones. And number 1,227 gave us the characteristic 5 hits on these peptides that told us this was a bone of a human. But what human, we couldn't tell.
So this little fragment, like how little is little are we talking about here?
Yeah, well, we're talking 2.4 centimeters. So you can see that it is really small, and it's completely nondescript. You would never know that it's a bone of a human. It could be from anything. But the peptide sequence told us that it was from one of the human family. But that is as far as we could get with the peptides. We really needed the DNA extracted to tell us exactly what it was. But yes, it's a tiny bone, nondescript, and from a bag of bones of thousands of bones that we can't tell apart.
So once you found it, I mean, did you put that in a vault or something? I mean, how do you ensure that that little fragment stays with you?
So we put it into a special yellow briefcase that Sam used to carry around. It's in my office here.
Are you serious or are you joking?
Vienna. No, I'm serious. Yeah, I still have it here. It's the bone is there. I'm going to take it back to Russia to give it back to my Russian colleagues because they store all of the human material from the Denisova site there. But I just haven't been able to get there for the last few years. So because of COVID, obviously. So it will be repatriated to its friends in due course.
That is good to hear. So Viviane, you took it from there. So you got a hold of this little fragment of bone, and it was up to you to try to use these DNA techniques. So what happened?
So yes, I was lucky to be at the right time at the right place in Leipzig, where Sam arrived with her little yellow suitcase with the bone in it. And so we sampled it together in the clean room at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. And we extracted the DNA. It got sort of the official name of Denisova 11, so the catalog number of the 11th human remain from Denisova. But as Tom can tell you, they had already nicknamed it Denny in the lab. And so Denny is what we often call her. Something very unexpected happened, is that we found that she matched both the Neanderthal variants and the Denisovan variants in almost equal proportions. So we had found this individual that had both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in almost equal extents.
Were you shocked? Were you shocked at that? Were you surprised by that result? Could it have been just the result of contamination?
Yeah, so that was actually my first thought was, oh, what did I do in the lab? Did I mix samples up? Like, how is that possible? And for quite a while, I was very unsure as to what the signal was due to. I do remember that the first time that I presented it in a lab meeting, and I was like, hey, people, look, I have this half and half. And people were sort of throwing around the word hybrid as a joke because nobody thought this was possible, that we would actually come across a mixed offspring, a sort of a mixed Neanderthal Denisovan. And I was certain that there was something wrong, that there was something, some mixture happening in the lab, some human error. And so we went back to the bone and we sampled it again and again and again. And a total of 6 different times, 6 different experiments, sort of from the beginning all the way till the sequencing. And again and again and again, we saw this analytical picture of half Neanderthal, half Denisovan. And just to be sure, this wasn't happening with other bones that we're working on in parallel. So it wasn't some kind of technical problem that was affecting sort of everything we're working on. This is really only this individual. And then we had, okay, so then, you start believing it. It happens over and over again. So it does seem that this individual has both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry. We saw that the scenario that is best supported is the fact that she had one parent of each group. And so since we know that she has the mitochondrial DNA, so what's coming from the mom that is Neanderthal-like, we can then infer the family tree of this 90,000-year-old individual and say she was the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father.
Wow. So that's an astounding discovery to have stumbled upon this first-generation blending of these 2 lineages. But Becky, when you heard of this work, I mean, what was your response? Because I gather you'd been thinking the necessity of bringing hybridization into the story for a long time. Were you like thrilled by this, or like, yeah, I already know that? What's so surprising about that?
I wasn't surprised. I was happy that F1 hybrid had finally been found. It didn't shock me in any way, I have to confess. But part of the reason it didn't shock me, as I think we've been seeing over the last decade of these genetic studies, is that hybrids aren't all that uncommon, right? I think the issue was, would you ever find a first generation one, which hadn't been found before? And eventually you're going to find a first generation one. Yeah, so I guess it wasn't a huge shock. But if I can speak a little bit to this hybrids aren't all that uncommon thing, I think one of the things that really that stands out for me in this work is that, and I think it's amazing, it's wonderful to find these genetic studies, but, as Tom was saying, we don't really know very much about what they look like. So we don't know much of anything in terms of morphology. We don't know if some other fossils that we don't have genetic evidence for might actually be Denisovans.
So Sheela, Becky made reference to the fact that she's not a great fan of this biological classification of species. And I don't want to put words in Becky's mouth, but I suspect part of that comes from when I was in 10th grade in Mrs. Goldberg's biology class, we learned that species were those groups that could not produce fertile offspring, right? And yet we seem to be talking about Denisovans, Neanderthals coming together and presumably yielding hybrids that can actually reproduce. So is it useful to talk about these two lineages as distinct species? And moreover, if they're all living together in this communal cave, how should we think about that part of the evolutionary past?
The study of living human variation has kind of gone through a healthy post-racial reckoning. And yet we're still talking about ancient human variation as branches on trees. So at a minimum, I think it prevents us from getting at really, meaningful answers about evolution. And at its worst, I think it can be dangerous because the people who live in these regions, I think, are kind of getting treated as branches on a tree, and that can have really problematic implications.
Yep.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please, Becky.
When these scenarios are painted that break human ancestors into different groups, one of the things that's been done is that one group is adaptively superior to the other, or better in some way. So they've adapted in different ways, and one is more advanced in terms of their intellect, more advanced in terms of their tools, more advanced in sort of all of these things. And I think that's what Sheela's speaking to in terms of reifying these very problematic ideas that we've eliminated in living people, but we continue to perpetuate when we're looking at the fossil record. And why that's really important is, to me, the fact that you have all the time. We look at something, look, you get DNA, oh, hybridization. Oh, there's another one, hybridization. Oh, another one. In human evolution, actually tells me something behaviorally. It tells me that these groups of people were coming together often, and that their behavior wasn't really all that different, and their culture wasn't really all that different. Because if it had been, I promise you, we wouldn't be seeing this sort of frequency of individuals who have these signatures of hybridization in the genome.
Tom, I'd like to hear your views on this too. Do you view the Denisovans as a different lineage, or what the right word is, a different group? Should we jettison the idea of thinking of them as different species? Tom, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated area, and I get uncomfortable talking about it to an extent. So I think the reason that we have these difficulties is that in terms of evolutionary time, we don't have to go back millions of years to find the last common ancestor of these groups. It's comparatively recent, right? I mean, if you're looking at Neanderthals and Homo Sapiens, let's say, you're looking at about 500,000 years, and for Denisovans and Neanderthals, comparatively briefer times. And that means that enough time and separation, geographical separation, hasn't accrued, hasn't gone by, that when they meet once more from their geographical separation, that they aren't able to produce offspring that then can go on themselves to have a healthy offspring. So, of course, we're going to have problems discussing this species concept, and it doesn't work as has been pointed out in this particular context. Labels are important, though, and I still think that when we're talking about, let's say, groups of Neanderthals and groups of Denisovans, that these labels have value. because we can see physical differences between these groups. We can see the morphology is very clearly different. And I think for that reason, they're important to maintain and to keep. But I agree with everyone that the species discussion is extremely and exceedingly complex. But to give you an example, well, when we're looking at Denisovans and Neanderthals, we know from the archaeological evidence and the fossil record and the genetic evidence that these are groups that are, largely speaking, in different parts of the continent of Eurasia. They're in the west in the case of Neanderthals. They're predominantly in the east in the case of Denisovans. And when Denisovans and Neanderthals met on occasion, they for sure had viable offspring. Whereas in the west, I should say, in the Neanderthal dominated part of Eurasia, we don't get any Denisovan DNA in that part of the world at all. And so there's a degree of separation.
And so using the available data, I know there's a portrait that's been painted, kind of artist rendition of what this lineage might look like. We can show it up on the screen. How accurate of an image do you guys consider this to be, and how useful is it, or is it not useful to sort of conjecture what things look like in the past based upon this very important but minimal data?
Yeah, so this is not based on the DNA code itself, and it's based on inferences of what one would expect to see when you get a specific type of regulation on the DNA versus another. I think it's very useful. It is, in some ways, inferences that would have to be validated against the fossil record and against genetic data. But I think it's very useful because it gives predictions as to what Denisovans looked like. And then we can take the fossil record that we know of and possibly new fossils that we found and try to see, okay, does that fit into our expectations of what a Denisovan would look like? And it's certainly better than what we had so far, which was 3 teeth, a piece of a bone, and then half a jaw. So anything more than that is more than welcome.
I mean, if we're walking around at the appropriate moment in the Pleistocene and we bump into the nearest Denisovan, is that the image that you imagine of the person that we'll encounter, that they'll look like that?
I think that is a fun inference, but it's impossible not to recognize that that's filtered through so many of our present day cultural lenses about what people look like. And so, if you look at the the very popular image of like an ape and then a stooped man and then an erect human, they're always brown-skinned and dark-haired until the last person, right? And so, there's obviously interesting science that's being brought to bear into these reconstructions, but ultimately reconstructions are interpretive.
Do any of you have any even just a gut guess about whether language use was part of the behavioral repertoire of Neanderthals? Or anyone want to go on a limb on that?
I'll make a guess.
Yeah, please.
I'll make a guess.
Becky.
I don't think they would have been interbreeding so much if they couldn't communicate. It just doesn't make sense. And speaking to what Tom was just saying, I mean, we also know that gene lineages don't, diverge the way humans do, and gene lineages don't mean species necessarily. So we have to be kind of careful in that space as well. I guess I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the way that the conversation has shifted here, and I'll tell you why. It's because it's sort of going back into this idea that we can find relatively pure groups, and the other's messy, kind of in the middle. So like the Western Neanderthals, for example, we call them classic Neanderthals. There's no evidence for interbreeding. They do look quite distinctly different. But that's not the case when we get, into other parts of the world where Neanderthals and other human groups were overlapping with each other. So I think I'm echoing Sheila's previous concern that we don't go back to this idea. And it's something we do. It's something we've been doing forever. Go back to this idea of just seeking out differences between these groups rather than trying to understand all of them in terms of this incredible variation, because that's what's happening. You're getting gene flow between these different groups, and what it's doing is it's contributing new variation to who we are today. It's, if you will, it's the fuel of evolution, right? It is allowing us to adapt and to move and to migrate into lots of different spaces, but it all still resides in us today. And so, if nothing else, it's actually it's a positive force. But I think if you think of a scenario where we have much lower population density than we have today, right? Really very, very low population density. You're going to have groups of these ancestors spread across this, which means just by definition, we're social animals, so we live in pockets within that. Because they're so dispersed on the landscape and because people migrate to get new resources and for other reasons, you're going to have differences that are due to chance. You're going to have differences that are due to adaptive differences within groups because they've settled in different regions of the world. And then they're going to come together every so often and they're going to exchange genes. And that's the pattern that we're seeing. It's actually reflecting a low density, and we haven't talked much about genetic drift and chance effects, but it's reflecting a low density of people on the landscape, gives them opportunities to diversify, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're meaningfully different, right? In a meaningful way. It just means that they're different, because we are too, at the end of the day.
So, in thinking about the various human lineages, Viviane, should we envision that the Neanderthals went extinct? Is that the right way of thinking about it?
So I think that historically people talked about Neanderthals, not so much about Denisovans we didn't know about, but about Neanderthals going extinct because the type of stone tools that they made at some point disappears from the fossil record. And at some point, the skeletons that can be attributed to them also, you just don't find them anymore. And so from this came the idea that they completely went extinct. Now, one of the actually first insights that came out of sequencing a Neanderthal genome was the fact that there is still Neanderthal DNA in people living today. So anyone living today that is not of sub-Saharan African ancestry carries between 1 to maybe 3% of their genome coming from Neanderthals. And so if you think about this like that, then perhaps Neanderthal didn't go extinct. In a way, they still live within us. So also for sequencing the Denisovan genome and then comparing that genome to people living today, we know that there's DNA of Denisovans in present-day populations. So if you go in Oceania, in some parts of Papua, for example, you have people living today that have up to 6% of the genome coming from Denisovans. That's quite a lot. And we do find also Denisovan DNA in other parts of Asia. And so, again, in some ways, they just didn't disappear. They still, parts of them live in us and still affect our genomes today.
I heard, and I don't know, you can correct me if this is just, one of those urban legends that you find on TikTok or Twitter, but that the way we in the modern era right now respond, say, to various viruses like COVID even, is potentially impacted by some of the Neanderthal DNA. Is that real? Is that nonsense?
Yes, it is real. It is real. And it's actually, I think, one of the interesting aspects of looking at Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA is that we can still think, how does it impact our own health in our own world today? And COVID is a great example that sort of came out of this unfortunate pandemic that hit us all, is that by comparing genetic variants that affect the susceptibility to develop COVID and severe COVID-19 symptoms, it was found that there is a specific genetic variant on chromosome 3 where people living today, if they have the Neanderthal type of this variant, they are more likely to develop severe symptoms of COVID-19 if they catch the virus. And so, as I said, this means that the Neanderthal DNA in us, or in some of us, still affects us today. And quite interestingly, sort of a few months later, with more analyses coming up, then another variant in another part of the genome was found. And this time, if you have the Neanderthal DNA, it's actually protecting you from COVID-19. So depending a bit on the lottery of genetics, it may be good and it may be bad to have Neanderthal DNA.
So Tom, Becky, with all this very recent work that's suggesting these interesting new perspectives coming from the finds in China, what do you think the the gestalt could be going forward in terms of thinking about the structure of our evolutionary past? Is it more a give and take across the world? Do we need to get rid of this old image, as Sheela was saying, where we're kind of imagining things flowing in one direction, not the other?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that, the narrative that was introduced in the beginning, the idea that you have one group of humans, that one group of humans becomes, more capable, becomes conquerors, becomes better adapted to being human, has all sorts of genetic changes that make them human, leaves the continent, conquers, right? And takes over the world. That was essentially the out of Africa narrative, such as it was. And that's pretty much demolished, right? It's not a thing. So I guess the question that we have going forward is what does this new narrative look like in detail? So I think we're slowly, it's like a slow progress moving away from this very simplistic, very replacement, very unidirectional model. And I suspect, if I'm going to kind of put myself out there, that as we get more and more information, and goodness, wouldn't it be nice to get more genetic information from Africa as well, that's deeper in time, that we're going to get exactly this, a much more complicated picture of movement, that it's going to be much more, I would say, evenly distributed than the picture that we're getting now. But we'll kind of have to see. We'll kind of have to see where this takes us.
So Becky, you've already emphasized your view that the older canonical out of Africa approach has been, in your words, demolished. Is it more just there's a blending, and because of that, some new hybrid emerges, and the whole notion of going extinct may be itself a too simplistic way of thinking about things?
That's a difficult question to answer. I'm going to say something first that I've been wanting to say, and that is that variation produces evolution, right? Evolution produces variation. This braided stream, if you will, of people has resulted in increasing variation. So the species that we have today has a lot more variation in it genetically than it would have had if some of those things hadn't happened. Bits and pieces were picked up and kept, and some things were lost and some things were kept, and they're put together in new and different ways, but we're very variable. And that gives us resilience, right? Resilience in the face of change, resilience in the face of new environments. And so something goes extinct. And that's not really what we're seeing, because none of this fully goes away in the human record. It's just producing this increased variation that has resulted in who we are today. And then to speak to something else that you mentioned, and you were talking about these new fossils and new fossils being found in different parts of the world and how exciting that is. And it's adding to our knowledge of the evolution of our lineage and of humans generally. Where people are looking matters. Who's doing the looking matters. Who has the money to do the looking matters. Who's shaping the choices and the narratives matters. And we've had a long history, certainly in paleoanthropology, of very specific groups of people out there and asking the questions and doing it in very specific kinds of ways, and often marginalizing others or simply not involving them at all. And so for me, that's kind of the most exciting path that we have going forward, is this ability to start to forge real relationships with people on the ground and start to have conversations that fit the global movement that we're having about, why are we so interesting? Why are we so diverse? And, how can we learn more about how we became these sort of complex, diverse humans that we are today?
So jumping off from that, one final question. I'm often asked the question about life in other worlds. I suspect you all are as well. And my view has always been that with the great number of planets and the great number of stars out there, I think most of us have an intuition that life has a good chance of being out there somewhere in the cosmos. But often I follow that by saying, but life is one thing and intelligent life is something completely different. because intelligent life, when you look at planet Earth, my previous view was there's like one single example of it, and by intelligent, I mean intelligence to the level where you can build a radio telescope, you can build a rocket ship. Should we view that intelligence itself has arisen many times on this planet in many different places, and therefore would that perhaps suggest that intelligence is more of a natural outgrowth of the evolutionary process as opposed to some singular event that bequeathed to the world Homo sapiens? Final words on that thought? Why don't we start with Tom?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the answer's got to be yes, because if we look again, harking back to some of the wider human family, the most well-known are Neanderthals. So we lose Neanderthals, we think, somewhere around 40,000 years ago. So between 40,000 years ago and today, that's a long tract of time. Neanderthals no longer had the possibilities of going through the climatic and environmental changes that we did, undergoing the selection pressures that we did, responding to various changes and adaptation that we did. And so running the tape again, I don't have too much doubt that Neanderthals could have got onto a very similar type of evolutionary trajectory that we did. Denisovans we know virtually nothing about in terms of their archaeology, but we have, as I say, we have this evidence that they were probably quite capable too. It's still emerging and still controversial, but if we accept that Denisovans made it to island Southeast Asia and east of Wallace's Line, they must have had a degree of technology to be able to do that. You can't just swim across those gaps. You have to have some kind of maritime-based technology. We know that hominins that were much earlier than that and older than that did too. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis on Flores and Homo luzonensis on the Philippines. And so, yes, I think it seems to me that it's more than likely that this type of ability and this type of intelligence that we formerly only see in us could have arisen more than once, yes.
Sheela, thoughts on intelligence and number of times it's arisen on planet Earth?
So, I mean, intelligence is a cultural construct, but I get what you mean, right? The idea that we are, we are the only species on Earth that turns the microscope on ourselves, right, and asks our own questions about ourselves. But I think we cannot possibly trace that back in the fossil and archaeological record without some of our own cultural biases. And so, historically, we talk about behavioral modernity in these very Western European terms. And so we look for art, and we look for adornment, and we look for, and those are what colonialists look for when they were trying to say that this civilization was, civilized or not. And so, to Tom's point, there are other ways to express extremely complex and abstract capabilities. Maritime technology and all of the implications of climatology, understanding astronomy and climatology, all the things that are required for doing any sort of maritime activities. Then I think that we shouldn't assume that it is the hallmark of Homo sapiens, because there's just so much evidence of these skill sets that we would consider abstract thinking that are present simply by the presence of a fossil record in Indonesia at 1 million years ago.
Viviane, the why birth of intelligence on planet Earth?
Yeah, so I think it's also important to think about the fact that we're not the only intelligent species out there, right? We're not the only ones who make tools. We're not the only ones who are capable of changing our environment in order to adapt to it. I think we are shifting from a way that we used to look at Neanderthals, or researchers used to look at Neanderthals as these sort of incapable, a bit stupid human beings that sort of were too stupid to survive. And we certainly, I think most of archaeologists today and people studying the past would agree that this is no longer what we think. And we think there was a lot of exchanges of culture and exchanges not only of genes between these populations, and that it is not only the intelligence that sort of drove us to still be around today.
Becky, you've got the final word. Intelligence on Earth, how widespread it may have arisen, and if you're willing, intelligence through the cosmos.
All I can think of is the octopus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
No, I mean, really, right? You know, the problem with defining intelligence, and this is a classic thing in primatology, is that for so long we define intelligence through the lens of ourselves, and through the lens of whoever's making those definitions is filtering. Okay, so can we measure them by us? Can a chimpanzee flint knap tools that are just like us? Okay, yeah, they can. But can they do it on their own? Would they come up with the idea? Right. So we're always filtering these things through our understanding of our type of intelligence. So I think that's one point. But more broadly to your question here, yes, all of these hominins, they've been constructing their niches for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, moving into different places. So they all had a very high level of intelligence. And I would definitely, absolutely, I'm sure there are other intelligent forms of life. Do they look like us? No. Probably not. And different planets, are they intelligent in ways that we can't understand at all because we crazy humans like to filter things through our way of thinking about intelligence and no other way? Yeah, they're probably really different, and we wouldn't maybe even be able to recognize the intelligence when we saw it.
Well, thank you all for this fascinating conversation on the present, potentially the future of our evolutionary past. So thank you all for joining us.